To assemble the circuit board for your stuffed animal or your hat or whatever e-textiles project you might be working on, you will of course need a circuit board. This video will walk you through how to assemble the Stitch version 2 circuit board. You will also need a 0.1 microfarad capacitor. That's what the small 104 on this capacitor means. You will need a button. You will need an integrated circuit socket holder for an AT-Tiny 85. So this one has 8 pins, slots for 8 pins, 4 on each side. You will need a buzzer or a piezo, and you will need a battery holder. This battery holder has slots for 3 batteries, which gives us a total of 4.5 volts, at least at the outset. You're going to need 3 batteries in order to properly power your circuit. The first step is to solder the capacitor to the circuit board here. It's going to go into these 2 holes right there. But before I put the capacitor in, I am going to put a little flux on those pads. And then I will put the capacitor in. It's worth mentioning that this is a ceramic capacitor, which means there is no polarity. I don't have to worry about which way I put it into the board. It can go either way. If this was an electrolytic capacitor and I put it in incorrectly, then I would damage it. So now that I have it in there, I'm going to solder first one side and then the other. I didn't use any tape to hold this one down, but if I recommend you use tape if you're first starting, but I didn't need to because the board itself was pushing the capacitor into the board. Now I'm going to trim each of these leads. And I think I can get that one a little bit closer. You want to be careful not to cut too close. You don't want to damage your board. I'm going to reheat up that last pad. It's called reflowing, and it will kind of make the solder ball up back on that pad. Same with this other one here. It just kind of makes a little bit smoother and better looking. The next step will be to solder on the button right here. So I'm going to put a little bit of flux on those 2 pads. And in this time around, I'm definitely going to use tape because getting that button to stay in is a lot trickier than getting the ceramic capacitor to stay in. Just using plain old masking tape. And I just kind of push it on there to hold it in place. If I look from the side, I just double check and make sure it looks like it's supposed to. Oh, not quite right. So I'm going to push this side in a little bit better. And then I'm going to solder. And I'm pushing down with my middle finger as well to kind of help push that button into the board. I look from the side. Looks like I got some fairly good Hershey Kisses going on there. The technical term for that is fillet. But for those of you who don't know the technical term, You want these to look like little Hershey's Kisses when you're done. I'm going to go ahead and cut this again. I don't want really long things poking out of the back of this board because we're going to sew it to our stuffed animal or to our hat, and this stuff will kind of catch on that felt or fabric, whatever you're using. And so trying to make it short and smooth will make our lives a little bit easier. So I'm going to be doing more reflowing in this video than I've done in my other videos. I'm getting kind of some horns popping up here, so to fix that, if you look, you can see it's kind of pointy. I'm just going to cut those little horns off, and I'm going to try and reflow again. It's a little bit of a trick to get it to not do that. It's not the end of the world if you have some small ones. It just, like I said, will make it sewing it to the felt a little bit less obnoxious, but it's not a big deal. The next part we're going to put on is the AT Tiny 84 or 85 circuit socket right there. So I'm going to, on the back side, put some flux in all those spots on all those pads. And then, again, I'm definitely going to use tape for this situation because it's kind of hard to keep that socket in the right spot. I'm also making sure that the notch in this socket lines up with the notch that's shown on the board. Kind of push it down there. And now, just going to go through and solder each one of those pins. Once you get done soldering all of the pins, you definitely want to cut them shorter because we're going to run some wire by them in a little bit, and we don't want the pins to poke into the wire. The wire actually goes next to them, but if it were to get kind of jostled around, it's possible that it might get underneath these and then get cut by them. So we want them to be as smooth as possible. I'm going to take the masking tape off now. Kind of try to get all that extra tin or lead. I'm using tin, but whatever type of solder you're using, you want to get all the extra off of your board and then go back and touch it up. You can see right now that it's a little bit rough on the top, but as I reflow it, it should turn out a lot smoother. The next step is to solder the buzzer to the board. You want to make sure that the plus sign on the buzzer lines up with the plus sign underneath the buzzer here. You see two plus signs, and some students get that confused. The plus sign right here, that's the positive hole that needs to line up with this plus sign. You also want to double check that the back side of the buzzer, that this pin lines up, so you can see there's a plus and a minus there. Every once in a while, the company that manufactures these will put this top plastic part on in the wrong way, and so it'll be wrong. I see that once in a blue moon. So double check and make sure that this pin that's next to the positive on the underside lines up with that plus sign. So I'm going to put a little flux on those pads. Now I'm going to put the buzzer into the board, making sure that those plus signs line up. And I'm going to use a piece of tape to hold that buzzer in place. And finally, for the last part, before I solder these cables for the battery pack to the circuit board, I'm going to expose a little bit more metal. And I'm going to do that by using some wire strippers. And I'm going to use the 22 gauge slot here. So I'm going to twist this so that it's right in there. Just like that. You can see about how much I'm going to cut off. It's not very much, just a little bit. I just kind of pull. I'm using my thumb as leverage to pull a little bit more, just a little bit. The same thing for the black one here. I get that little piece of insulation out of there. Just like that. And then I'm going to put a little bit of flux on the end of each one of these wires. And then I'm going to tin the wire. Tinning the wire means just putting a little bit of solder on the wire. And the reason we do that is to make it so that it's a lot easier to solder to. I'm going to bend this black insulation wire up just a bit so it's kind of a little bit above the soldering surface here. Okay. The next step is to solder the battery pack cables to the circuit board here. The black would go to ground and the red would go to the positive side here. And if this were like the boards that I've bought in the past, this is how we would do it. We'd solder these cables directly to the surface of the board, and within a short amount of time they would wiggle around and they would break. And that's because when you solder the connection right there on the board, it becomes a solid, right? Right now we have kind of a flexible cable, but we make it solid right at that soldering point. And when it gets solid there, that's where it breaks. We need the cable to be able to flex because, you know, if it's in a hat or clothing or stuffed animal or something, the battery pack's going to get moved around a little bit. And we want it to be able to flex without breaking. So my revolutionary design here, which I've seen in a few other places, but I've never seen it on an e-textiles board, and that is I weave my wires through the circuit board. I've got these two slots on this side here that I put the wires in, and then I put them through the hole in the back side. And you can see now why we wanted to make the integrated circuit socket joints kind of smooth, because we don't want them to accidentally poke a hole in the insulation for this wire. So now you can see that I've got two wires going into my circuit board that poke out the top side. It's a little bit hard to see here. If I turn it sideways, now you can see them. to keep those in place while I'm soldering, I'm just going to take a little piece of masking tape and put it on the back. And then I will solder on the front. You got to be real careful not to touch any of the components on the top side of this board. You don't want to accidentally melt your button or your integrated circuit socket. We trim these leads for the battery holder. There we go. Now we have a fully assembled stitch board. You can see that when I wiggle these cables, I can pretty much wiggle them all day long and they're not going to break. That's because inside the insulation here for these two wires, the individual threads of metal, they haven't been soldered together, so they're still really flexible. And when I wiggle, that wiggling doesn't really affect the wires as they go underneath the board, right? It's absorbed or restricted by these slots right here. And so no real wiggling occurs next to the two spots that we soldered here and here. So our power supply should remain attached to our board for hopefully a very long time.